send him a WhatsApp.
Yeah, thank you, because I don't have his number.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that.
Sarah, I'm opening the webinar. It's less than 1 minute to go.
Okay.
And recording is on.
So welcome to the GEO Climate Policy and Finance Workshop. My name is Sara Venturini, Climate Coordinator at the GEO Secretariat, and I will be your chair for today's meeting. This is the third and last day of the workshop. During the first 2 days, we have gathered over 30 speakers from the GEO community to present their work on Earth observation to support climate policy, both at the national and the international level. What we found is that many GEO work program activities are already generating Earth observation data and products that support the implementation of the Paris Agreement nationally, particularly on adaptation. And they are now also exploring a possible contribution to the global stocktake process. And today, in fact, the focus of the discussion and the set of presenters is quite different from the usual GEO family. Day 3 is dedicated to understanding what the Earth observation can do to inform investment decisions that build resilience to climate change. So moving on to the agenda of day 3. The program, again, is quite packed with speakers covering 2 main themes. Session 1, Earth observation in support of public climate finance, will go until 10:30. And session 2, Earth observation in support of private climate finance from 10:30 to 12. So the event is about 3 hours. Hopefully there can be a 10 minutes break around halfway through the meeting. And the goals for today's session really are to first get an overview of what everyone is doing on Earth observation and climate finance, both in the public and private domain. And secondly, we wish to raise awareness of this line of work within the GEO community. We would like to understand what the challenges are and engage the interests of the community in engaging further. And this, in our view, will effectively launch a new work stream in GEO and present opportunities to initiate collaborations between Earth observation data providers, governments, and the sustainable finance industry. So I would like to give you a few instructions to participate more actively in the meeting. First of all, I would like to ask you to indicate your full name and affiliation so we can know who you are when you interact with the panelists. And how to interact is to post your questions in the Q&A box. The speakers will respond in writing, or we will pick them up for the open discussion at the end of each session. As I said, the program is quite dense and I will have to be very strict with time management. So the speakers are requested to please keep the intervention within the time limit so we can have a good discussion afterwards. I would hate to interrupt you. But if you see me appearing, it means that you're running out of time. And be aware that we are recording this event and we will post it on the GEO website after the workshop next week and together with all the presentations. And we hope that all this discussion will inform future discussions in GEO, and for that we are preparing a workshop report which will be shared with everyone later. finally, if you're active on social media, please use the hashtag Earth Observation for Impact, EO for Impact, and follow GeoSec on Twitter so we can have a good chat around the workshop as well. So I would like to now introduce Jana Gevorgyan, our new Secretariat Director, who started in July 2021 and will present the vision for a climate finance campaign in GEO. Jana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, potentially good evening in some parts for some of our participants. Welcome to day 3 of our climate policy and finance workshop. We're delighted to have some of you joining us from the past 2 days and really happy to have new attendees on this day 3. Can we go to the next slide, please? So for those who may not know still, GEO was envisioned back in 2003, in fact, when this image was created by an illustrator for The Economist, before there was even GEO, with this vision, a pretty clear vision that decisions for the benefit of humankind be informed by environmental information that is derived from systematic observations of the Earth, based on systematic measurements of the vitals of the Earth. Why? Because Earth observations provide objective information, provide transparency to policies, to governance. And so that vision that was created then still is very much true today. You can't argue with the doctor's diagnosis, as you can see on this fun slide. And we all know what the diagnosis is. The diagnosis is that we all need to be acting faster, with more commitment, with more resolve, and with specific actions. So GEO has been working towards this end by developing science-based, research-based activities within our GEO work program, some of which we reviewed in the past 2 days. And we obviously want them to impact decisions in the policy space. So we want them to be policy relevant. That is also what we highlighted over the past 2 days. But actions based on smart policies also need finance to back those actions. So it's pretty clear today in 2021 that conversations need to be taking place, robust and systematic conversations need to be taking place among these 3 communities: scientists, researchers, technologists, policy makers, and the financiers. It's really by bringing these communities together that we can achieve a faster pace of informing policy with Earth observations, but also ensuring that there is finance available to back those actions. And so that's what we're doing here today. We're effectively laying a cornerstone for a new pillar in the GEO portfolio. It was envisioned by the GEO Climate Change Working Group and the GEO Secretariat because of this need that is now not just in the policy discourse, but even in the public discourse. We're fortunate not to have to start from ground zero. The foundation is already there because international regimes and multilateral mechanisms for allocating and providing finance in support of national plans for climate change adaptation and mitigations do exist. And we are really happy to have some of the biggest players in that space joining us here today. So then what is really the role of GEO in building out this new pillar, this climate finance pillar within our portfolio? Well, we want to do what we do well, or so we contend. We are convening this strategic conversation, these strategic partners together to augment and amplify the efforts of these organizations that are already taking place in the various parts and the various sectors. So if we can go to the next slide. So today we are effectively, as Sarah said, we're starting this conversation. We're laying this cornerstone for this pillar, which we intend to make part of GEO's mainstream. That's really the intention here, to systematize this conversation and to really foster lasting and enduring conversations with the partners in the finance space, in the policy space, and in the science space. So today is all about exploration. It's about validating that the interest is there, perhaps not gauging interest. We want to believe that it's there, so we just want to validate our intention. The next phase then will be to actually scope out specific action-oriented activities, pilots, accelerators, around which we can actually put the portfolios together of science, policy, and finance. We intend to hold, hopefully, in-person engagement events to determine which sectors represent the low-hanging fruit, so that critical mass of governments can benefit from these activities, and so they can easily plug into the existing and emerging plans of the governments to adapt to climate change through their NAPs and NDCs. We're already cooking up sort of a pilot accelerator or catalyzer, which we hope will also help demonstrate the potency of the approach that we're here to discuss. And then subsequently, we intend to build out a whole portfolio of actions that will represent this continuous path of GEO working with the finance sector, science community, and policy communities to roll out this campaign on a sustained basis, on a sustained level. So far, I've been talking about all of this kind of with the view of the government as being the main caretakers of the humankind, for whom we want to make smart and responsible decisions. But we know that our audience has expanded. And in fact, our audience now includes also corporations, banks, and even the civil society. And so as the private sector and the corporate world is also becoming progressively aspirational in meeting net zero ambitions and goals, and making investments in portfolios that are environmentally and socially conscious, and has to respond to various regulations about disclosing their climate risks through risk assessment, we obviously want to make sure that that sector, the non-public sector, also becomes eager consumer of Earth observation and information that is derived from Earth observations. And so that is the second track, the second priority area that we wish to explore more and better integrate into the mainstream of the GEO activity. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what we're after. And I really want to thank the many of you who are joining us here today for this ceremony of laying the cornerstone for the climate campaign pillar in GEO. The results and outcomes of this workshop are going to be put together into a report that we intend to introduce in Glasgow at COP26. Also then to build into the GEO Week 2021 in the week of November 22nd, to introduce it to the broader GEO audience, and really to build on as part of our mainstream GEO portfolio moving forward. So again, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to all the discussions and enlightening presentations that we are about to kick off. Sarah, you never disappear, so I don't know how I was doing on time. So hopefully I made the target.
You did. In fact, we're a bit early, but I'd like to indeed move on to the next session. And this is going to have three key presentations, one from the Green Climate Fund, the second from the World Meteorological Organization, and the third from UNOSAT and the Commonwealth Secretariat jointly. So I'm turning now to the first speaker, Joseph Inseful, Senior Climate Information and Early Warning Systems Specialist from the Green Climate Fund. Joseph will tell us how Earth observation can strengthen funding proposals from countries for climate action projects, both for mitigation and adaptation under the Green Climate Fund. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Sarah and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I bring you warm greetings from the Green Climate Fund. By way of introduction, we know that in terms of natural disasters, if you look at the period between 1970 and 2019, 79% of all natural disasters are due to hydromet hazards. And 56% of that, 75% of economic losses, which translates into $2.4 trillion annually, or 0.2% of world GDP, is due to hydrometeorological hazards. And more importantly, also 1.4 million deaths resulting from these impacts is in LDCs. As if these were not problematic enough, disasters are projected to increase as climate change gathers pace. And so by virtue of this, the Paris Agreement, if you look at subsection 7C, calls for strengthening scientific knowledge on climate, including research, systematic observation of the climate system and early warning systems in a manner that informs climate services and supports decision making. The GCF board also, B0704, calls for increased generation and use of climate information in decision making. So the desired transformation in terms of investment for both adaptation and mitigation action to reduce the impact of climate variability and change is investment and a reliable climate information services to support well-informed science-based decision making. Next. But there are challenges that countries faces in terms of addressing this need of providing robust climate information. Some of them are due to lack of enabling environment, lack of coverage and scale in terms of the quantitative and qualitative infrastructure that is needed to deliver to deliver climate services, uncoordinated intervention, limited budgets for governments, the complexity of the production, dissemination, and uptake of climate information, and more importantly, also the risks associated in terms of the market barriers to creating an enabling environment. Next. So this is where GCF comes in. Next. To date, GCF investment is $23.1 billion in terms of total portfolio with co-financing, and 1.2 billion gigatons of CO2 equivalent in terms of expected mitigation potential of those investments, and building the resilience of over 408 million people globally. But then if you unpack this in terms of the distribution across the various regions, we have Latin America and the Caribbean benefiting from $1.5 billion of GCF investment for projects. If you look at readiness support, we have 73 million. And also if you look at Africa, 2.7 billion in terms of projects, 85.4 million in terms of readiness. Asia Pacific has 2.6 billion in terms of project and 85.4 million in terms of readiness support. Next. GCF also is very flexible as the leading climate fund. We are flexible in terms of the way we deploy our investment, the way we structure our financial instruments. So you see the thematic areas in terms of adaptation and mitigation. We have 48% for adaptation and 52% for mitigation. In terms of public and private sector investment, we have 33% for private sector, 67% investment in the public sector. And then also we have our instrument, the financial instrument, with grant being the biggest, 44%, and loans 43%, equity, resource-based payment, and guarantees also being part of the financial instrument that we deploy. Next. But then the private sector plays a very important role. If you look at the way GCF is set up, private sector will bring much of the impact that we need in terms of greening the industrialization process and helping us reduce CO2 emissions and building resilience in our vulnerable communities. So GCF focuses on climate funds, financial institutions, project finance, climate markets, climate technology, and innovation, where these 5 areas of practice are leveraged to maximize mobilization and impact. Next. So if you look at the investment of GCF in terms of climate information and early warning system, to date, GCF investment it exceeds 1.8 billion, but with co-finance, we have $2.2 billion that goes into generation and application of climate information services. The distribution also varies across regions. We have for the Asia Pacific 44%, Africa 34%, Latin America and the Caribbean 20%, Eastern Europe 2%. And then international entities that access our funds constitute about 94%, with direct access entities constituting 6%. But then we see from our portfolio that 21% of the projects goes into modernization of hydromet service. That means to generate the information that we need for decision making. And 79% focus on application. So the aid resort area, the sectors that GCF intervenes, constitute the majority of the demand for climate information and early warning systems. Next. And so this gives a very clear way in which investments need to take place within the GCF pipeline and portfolio. The conceptual framing that has come out through looking at the portfolio and the paradigm shifting pathways is when the climate information services investment goes into modernization of hydromet services and regional hydromet programs to bring in the economy of scale. And this will lead to generation of relevant science-based information that goes into 2 critical pathways that we have observed in our portfolio. One is the impact-based multi-hazard early warning system for early action in terms of the short, medium-term risk management. And then we also have climate information and early warning system for investment and financial decision-making to reduce long-term disaster risk. So these 2 main critical pathways, which we find in terms of the demand that we are getting from countries, is expected to be transformed into desired transformation, which is investment for both adaptation and mitigation. And a reliable climate information service and early warning system will inform science-based decision making. Next. And so these paradigm shifting pathways are very, very critical, and there are drivers of these pathways. The 4 main drivers that we think will enable us to create transformational projects is transformational planning and programming. That is, the climate science informs strategic plans and country programming. Implementation aimed at coherence and complementarity, efficiency and effectiveness to make sure that the investments maximize the impact on the ground. We also think that catalyzing climate innovation is critical. We will say that over 80% of climate information is actually IT services. So innovations in terms of the Global Framework for Climate Services, G-Bond, which my colleague and friend Mark will talk about, impact-based forecasting, forecast-based financing. But more important, IoT, big data, cloud computing needs to underpin project design, create a strategic partnerships, and quality management, and improve policy. And then we also have to mobilize investment at scale. That is, we need innovative financing options enabled by blended financing and key partnership to leverage and scale up investment. And then the 4th driver is expansion and replication of knowledge in terms of knowledge brokering on climate investment, the science and technology through institutional collaboration, monitoring, evaluation, and learning to ensure that the impact evaluation is underpinned or used in future programming. And more importantly, also this GCF could play a stronger role in terms of synergetic action between the government and the government. Next. So I would like to conclude with one example from Timor-Leste. This is a project that we are implementing in Timor-Leste through UNDP, safeguarding rural communities and their fiscal access for climate-induced disasters. And these are very critical issues within Timor-Leste. The issues that we are addressing is to do with impact-based multi-hazard early warning system for climate resilient rural infrastructure planning and management. And in this, we provide forecasting, risk modeling, communication, and response to enable the government of Timor-Leste to better plan infrastructure development in rural communities that are critical for managing climate risk. And also, we are also supporting implementation in terms of action on the ground, risk-proofing measures for strengthening resilience of small-scale rural infrastructure, will constitute a number of interventions, including roads, water supply, improved irrigation systems, flood, and then agroforestry and reforestation. And this project has the ability to really transform Timor-Leste, particularly the vulnerable areas. So we have $22.36 million and the potential to really transform and build the resilience of these vulnerable communities. Next. So thank you very much, and I'm hopeful to address any questions that will arise from this presentation.
Thanks, Joseph, for a very interesting insight, especially on how Earth observation is used to support baseline data on climate and information to enable early warning in the context of projects funded by the Green Climate Fund. There is a question for you on the difference between an actual project and the readiness program. You may reply in the Q&A box, or we can discuss that during this panel discussion. But yeah, just to say that our community is not very familiar with all this climate finance work. So the next speakers may also want to present the concepts in, with the in a way that is understandable to Earth observation providers and a community that hears about this for the first time. Thank you. And I'm now turning to the next speaker, Markus Rapnick. Markus is the Director of Development Partnerships at WMO and will present an innovative financing facility to support Earth observations from WMO. Markus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, colleagues. Let me start by emphasizing the importance of this workshop and today's topic, namely Earth observation for climate finance decision. Because I personally have experienced that the Earth observation community and the climate finance community are very distinct communities. Rosar, as I just mentioned, speak different languages in different aspects. But both communities that need to come together urgently in a much better way, as Jana, you mentioned in your opening remarks, given the global challenges that you, Joseph, just outlined that we are all confronted with. Now, I come from the development and climate finance community. Little did I know about the Earth observation community until I joined WMO 4 years ago. And through our work on establishing SOFT, the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, we want to create a mechanism that brings these communities together with a single purpose: to substantially increase the generation and international exchange of basic surface-based weather and climate observations for better climate finance decisions, public and private climate finance decisions. Before joining WMO, I was aware of the importance and increasing availability of satellite data. I had no clue about the importance of surface-based observations, the huge gap in the provision of this data, and the impact of this gap on climate policy and finance decision making. Next, please. The images on this slide show today's gaps on upper air observation, left part, and surface observation, right part. And as you might imagine, blue is good, red is bad. And what do you see? A lot of red, in particular in least developed countries small island developing states, and in Africa. Next slide, please. Now, you colleagues from the Earth observation community, you of course know surface-based observations are crucially important. First, they are essential for weather and climate prediction models. Second, they measure weather and climate variables that cannot be reliably observed from space, atmospheric pressure, for example. And third, they play a vital role in the anchoring, calibration, and validation of satellite data. Next. So a key message is we need both satellite observations and surface-based observations. And while there are huge investments in satellite observations, investments in surface-based observation are both neglected and provided in a highly ineffective manner. Actually, let me be blunt, today we are wasting a lot of public money in trying to strengthen basic surface-based observations in developing countries. Next, please. So we have a problem, a major problem. We are missing surface-based observations for better global prediction, for better climate policy and finance decisions. Therefore, in 2019, the 193 member countries and territories of the World Meteorological Congress decided to establish the GBON, already referred to by Joseph, the Global Basic Observing Network. For the first time, through GBON, there is an international agreement and obligation with clear requirements for all countries to collect and internationally exchange the most essential surface-based weather data, clearly defined. Next slide, please. So what is SOF and why do we need SOF? It is crystal clear. Without fundamentally changing the way developing countries are supported in the generation and international exchange of basic weather climate observations, there is no way that these countries ever will achieve GBON compliance. Because we have first the wrong financing model and second the wrong delivery model of international support. First, we have the wrong financing model because we ask even the poorest countries to fully cover all costs related to the generation and international exchange of basic weather and climate observations. Observations that constitute a global public good. We are dreaming. The value of observational data is independent of the income status of the country. Actually, studies, ECMWF, have shown that one additional radio sonde flown over the Pacific is 50 times more valuable than an additional radio sonde flown over Europe. Yet the poorest and most vulnerable countries simply don't have the financial means to generate and exchange this data. Second, we have the wrong delivery model. As also Joseph highlighted Joseph, in your barriers, a fragmented, time-bound, project-by-project approach, leading to a hodgepodge of investments and technologies in the country, wasting public resources. Therefore, we are creating the SOF. So who is we? Sarah, you introduced me that I'm going to present the WMO SOF. SOF is actually a commitment and priority of the Alliance for Hydromet Development that brings together the 13 major development and climate finance partners and WMO, including the Green Climate Fund. And thank you very much, Joseph, for your leadership on this. Now, the Alliance has set the creation of the SOF as a priority, and 3 members of the Alliance, WMO, UNDP, and UNEP, are going to co-create the SOF as United Nations Multi-Partner Trust Fund later this year. SOF created as a single-purpose global vehicle to support the generation and international exchange of basic weather and climate observations in new ways. Next slide, please. Now, the meteorological value chain familiar to you in the Earth observation community starts with observation from across the globe and ends with effective policy investment decision making. This chain can only be as strong as the weakest part of the chain. And today, the chain is very weak or even broken in its initial parts: surface-based observation and international exchange of the data. Through SOF, we are aiming to fix this. Next slide. Now, how does SOF aim to make a difference? Through first, the provision of innovative finance. Second, a global approach with sustained international exchange of data as the single measure of success. And third, enhancement of technical competency and coordination in a very complex technical environment related to the generation and international exchange of basic observations. I don't want to go into details on this slide, but I want to highlight the aspects of innovative finance. So SOF is going to provide long-term finance beyond project cycles, predictable finance, grant finance only, so no loans or soft loans, because we recognize the value of the global public good of this data. Second, SOF is tackling the elephant in the room, namely contributing to finance long-term operations and maintenance costs, and doing this through a results-based finance approach. Next slide, please. Now, if we are successful, what would this translate into? It would translate into a 28-fold increase of surface observations international exchange from 75 SITs and LDCs, up to 28 times more data generated and exchanged from these countries. Now, according to the World Bank, this in turn will create direct economic benefits of at least $5 billion a year, which will enable the full realization of socioeconomic benefits of weather and climate prediction in the amount estimated by the World Bank of $162 billion per year. Next, please. Now, let me close by coming back to the title of today's workshop: Earth Observation for Climate Finance Decisions, Public and Private, and sum up in 4 points. First, SOF provides the data foundation for effective climate finance decision. Today, we are partially flying blind, making decisions without proper databases, in particular in SITs and LDCs in Africa. Second, SOF will allow for a much more efficient allocation of scarce public resources, guided by the GBON investment criteria and standards. Third, SOF will enable a coordinated global approach to strengthen basic surface-based observations, contrary to today's fragmented modus operandi. And fourth, SOF will have an inclusive governance structure that brings together all major partners, including climate finance and Earth observation partners. And GEO is proposed to be part of the SOF Advisory Board. So GEO contributing to shaping the future of SOF. Last slide, please. So what is the roadmap to COP26 around the corner and beyond? The objective is crystal clear. We want to open the SOF doors for business by June next year. In order to do so, we need to mobilize $200 million with a minimum threshold of 50 million by COP26. We have scheduled the Third Potential Funders Forum next Monday, the Pledging Forum end of October, and we want to announce the creation of SOF at the COP in Glasgow. We count on the financial support from bilateral and multilateral partners to provide the data foundation for more effective climate policy and investment decisions, public and private. And we count on the many stakeholders and partners to work together in new ways in supporting developing countries in the generation and international exchange of foundational weather and climate data, acknowledging valuing the global public good of basic observations. Thank you very much. And I see Sarah, you're appearing. So apparently I've been overrunning. Thank you very much.
No, you're perfect. Thanks, Markus. It is great to hear how this initiative is involving multiple partners in creating the foundations of effective climate investments in developing countries. And thank you for extending the invitation to DIO to participate in the advisory board. It would be good to discuss how we can support this effort with our large network of experts on the ground. And I'm now turning to the next speakers. Einar Björgo, Director of UNOSAT at UNITAR, and Unikrishna Nair, Head of Climate Change at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So Einar and Unikrishna are presenting an existing effort and a collaboration where climate finance is already yielding concrete results together with national governments in the Pacific. Over to you, Einar.
Thank you very much. And thank you again so much for the invitation. And I'm really excited about this workshop. If you can have the next slide, please. So the common sensing approach. This is an approach that we have initiated a couple of years ago. And I think just the main backdrop here is really to look at the Earth observation community as a whole. In my view, in the past, we have failed a bit in making sure that countries can truly benefit from this technology because we wrongly assumed that they would come to us, that people would automatically understand the value because we understood it. Now, this is something that we wanted to sort of flip around and see that in order to have this technology, Earth observation, climate science, being really adapted at the country level, we have to go and learn how this can be best done. So this is a bit the background for how we choose this project, which has been financed by the UK Space Agency and will also, through its international partnership program, and will also be carried on for another couple of years, thanks to funding from NORAD. Now, the main objective here is really to enhance climate resilience in vulnerable countries in Asia Pacific and Africa through satellite-based solutions. So how do we do that? Well, in the Pacific, we have developed two things: a technical platform, including data cubes, but also focusing very much on capacity development in 4 distinct areas that were identified through scoping missions, through close interactions with the countries themselves. So this is both in terms of climate science and climate forecast, food security, disaster risk reduction, and as you can see also, very much so in terms of climate finance. Next slide, please. So in terms of the challenges, and I think this also echoes a bit what we saw on some of the previous slides, we see many challenges, especially in developing countries, where information can be very scattered. There's not necessarily a central point for data sharing facilitation. Also, the costs of advanced GIS tools can be very high, and of course also high resolution satellite imagery. In terms of national capacity, for many of these countries, these are very small countries with very limited capacities in terms of public expertise. Next slide, please. So what we did, again, I want to emphasize, together with the countries, we developed a technical platform, which is one thing, on geospatial and climate information tools. So I'm not going to go into too much details here, but we basically, we included a lot of historical data. We included climate information. We included risk layers, as well as local data. And here also I want to emphasize the importance of combining data, not just using Earth observation data and think that that's going to solve everything. It's not going to solve everything. You have to combine this information with information such as hazard data, and other things. So in order to do so, we are able to then develop a tool, a technical platform that is being used by national focal points. So in the Pacific, we are now using this actively in Fiji, in Vanuatu, and in the Solomon Islands, because we also placed colleagues sitting with the governments over time, So for 3 or even 4 years, they will be sitting there and even beyond in helping the government to really mainstream these tools into their decision-making processes. So based on that, of course, we're also developing reports and having these reports into different sectors, such as agriculture, disaster risk reduction, but also what you will see in terms of future opportunities for climate finance. Next one, please. We have very good feedback on this, decision support systems. One user, as you can see, really find this as a fantastic resource, including a broad spectrum of useful and relevant data sets, including climate finance proposals, applications for this. So what we see that, having access to the current information combined with the historic information and also building an understanding of future climate and risks is really this package that we're trying to put together. That is being used by technical experts, by sectoral experts, by decision makers, and also more and more by secondary regional users. It's very important also to include, of course, in the Pacific, you have a very strong regional Earth observation community as well, and it is extremely important to also include, of course, those. Next one, please. But also, very importantly, we are also focusing on capacity development. Again, taking the time and not thinking that you can go in and do, a one-day workshop or one-week workshop, and these systems are going to be used. No, they will not be used then. So therefore, we are really looking at staying over time with the government, making sure that we listen to their needs. We have awareness raising events, we have technical training, we have technical cooperation, also what we call technical backstopping, actually, that has become immensely popular. It can be just small things, maybe a department may need, for example, just to know what is the status of the forest, for example, and they can then, being able to use this technology, they can focus in on an area and really look at very detailed what is the situation right here. In terms of the target groups, we're looking at technical staff, specialized analysts, and also decision makers. Next one, please. So basically what we're trying to do is really to combine all this information. We are fostering evidence-based decision-making by transforming this satellite data into actionable insights. And to do so, we have done it in many different ways, both in terms of disaster risk management. We're looking at natural hazard, tropical cyclones, floods, and landslides, looking at mangrove forests, for example, as well. We have also been looking at COVID preparedness. We were able to quite fast, I would say, turn around and also make use of this technology, not necessarily in terms of this topic, but again, technical backstopping and having people in the countries very fast moving to provide the countries with much needed information product when it comes to the COVID response. But also, of course, looking at sea level rise, human mobility, we have developed a dedicated tool where you can, together with the communities, you can sit and you can decide which factors are most important, and by using that, you can propose places of where potential communities may need to move because they can no longer stay where they are. Including also, of course, protection of World Heritage Sites. We have been looking at oil spills, illegal logging, etc. So at the local level, we are then also able to see how these various national level funds can then access the climate funds. So looking at, for example, in Fiji, Rural Electrician Fund, climate change relocation, decarbonization and public bus transport, etc. So it's really about, again, having this technology being used locally at the national level based on really informed decisions. I then hand over to my colleague, Uni.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aina, and thanks for this opportunity, GEO, to talk about this all-important topic of use of climate data or the satellite data for climate action. So when member countries are now moving forward from NDC submissions to more investment planning and bankable projects, I think it's all the more important that we provide and we facilitate data and availability of useful and informative data for member countries to develop these proposals. And we found there's a lot of gaps, and definitely this is an opportunity to work around. So this is one classical example where the Commonwealth is joining hands with UNITA and UNOSAT in terms of using this Earth observation data based platform, common sensing, for the benefit of the member countries. So we are currently working in Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Vanuatu, and these are classical examples where we try to use the Earth observation data. For example, the Fiji Rural Electrification Project or the decarbonization of public transport by electrical buses. You imagine how we use satellite data to establish such projects as well as to monitor and move forward. So these are good examples. Next slide, please. So basically, the Commonwealth works under its flagship program called the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. So the Climate Finance Access Hub is a facility which is based on a CHOGM, which is the Commonwealth Heads of the Government Meeting mandate to the Secretariat to support member countries in accessing climate finance. So the Access Hub is situated or is headquartered in Mauritius we have around 15 advisors sitting in different parts of the world catering to this particular issue of access to finance, and we follow a hub and spokes model, and we are pioneers in doing that since 2014-15, and we know there are many other organizations who came up with similar ideas later on. So this kind of a multilateral approach is basically what will help local action in many of the member countries. I saw a question in the chat that how would you use this information for access to finance at local level. So that's basically what we are trying to do with different partners. So the significant scope to improve access to finance using GEO data is basically felt when we evaluated with the Green Climate Fund support, thanks to the independent evaluation unit's thorough assessment, which gave a clear picture that availability of clinching data is one of the reasons why we have delays in submission and also delays in taking the process through the pipeline to approved projects. So the Climate Finance Access Hub did a very detailed evaluation of this, and once again in collaboration with UNOSAT as well as with the other common sensing partners and the GCF, basically to come up with a discussion paper that talked about how the Earth observation data will help in improving the access to climate finance, and also how do you use it in the ground level. It's data is available everywhere, but how do you use that data to analyze and develop information that will feed into the kind of sectoral project proposals. So we have demonstrated it in many projects now in many of our member countries using the Earth observation data available from the governments. But this is an example. Common sensing is an example where we have gone beyond that value chain, and we have also developed the platform, and this platform is now it's an evolving platform, so definitely there'll be more data going into the platform. So now for example, when we looked at the post-COVID situation, we had issues of COVID plus extreme climate events coming together. So how do you use Earth observation data to facilitate action in such situations? We did that in the case of Amphan, when the Amphan cyclone hit Bangladesh, and also in the other tropical cyclones that we saw in the recent times. So the complexity of the issue is increasing, and climate change is exacerbating all those complexities, but definitely Earth observation data is going to be crucial. So we saw how epidemiological data became very important over and beyond the climate data for the tourism sector to open up post-COVID. So all these, if you overlay these kind of Earth observation data, we do get results in quick time frame. And the Climate Finance Access Hub of the Commonwealth Secretariat is committed to this, and so we are partnering with UNOSAT on this, and as Einar mentioned, we'd like to take it forward with other member countries in the Pacific and also the membership of the Commonwealth, and see that this emerges as a global platform. And recently, all of you might have also heard the news that UNOSAT is the major data providing arm for the UN system. So with that, with common sensing developing as a global platform, I'm sure it is going to make access to climate finance a very a tangible and a doable thing at the local level. And the Climate Finance Access Hub and the advisors placed in the member countries will always be committed to support this initiative. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks both for providing a clear picture on how climate finance can unlock concrete action in areas where Earth observation data can make a clear difference. DIO2 has been especially targeting the Pacific countries for more engagement lately. And in fact, on the first day of the workshop, we heard from the Director General of the Pacific community and the priority needs for Earth observation from that region. And I think it will be good to discuss further how UNOSAT, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and GEO can join forces in the future. So this concludes the first session, and I'd like to call on our moderator, John Firth, Senior Director, Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers Watson. John has over 30 years experience in climate impacts and adaptation, and is a long-standing collaborator of GEO, previously with Acclimatize. So I'd like to open the panel discussion with all the speakers of this session. Please turn back on your camera. There are a couple of guiding questions that the moderator will address, in addition to the clarification questions on the presentations that we have collected in the Q&A box. So please continue posting the questions, and the speakers will respond in writing or live. And the two questions really are elaborating on the presentations you've just delivered. What else can we say about Earth observation supporting access to climate finance in developing countries, and especially how the GEO community can contribute to these ongoing efforts, or can potentially join forces for new initiatives on enabling access to climate finance. So John, over to you for the interesting discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to the presenters. I found that really both interesting and quite exciting, actually, because I just a quick view from me, it did feel to me like there was just so much that connected each of these presentations together, and there were some common themes coming out of them, and not least on this idea of it's about collaboration. It's about working together. It's about joining forces with other data providers and other systems to understand what the combined value is of what we all have. And I thought that was quite exciting, actually. Joseph, I just wanted to ask you a quick question, actually, because one of the things that struck me is on one of your early slides, you showed the split of the finance into different parts of the region. And I noticed that the Latin America and Caribbean was significantly lower in relative terms to the other regions of the world. Is there a specific reason about Latin America and Caribbean? And I'm hoping it's an issue of data and understanding and being able to describe problems and potentially solutions, which is where EO could obviously help. Is there something specific about Latin America, Caribbean that the Earth observation community needs to focus on?
Thank you very much, John, for the question. I mean, GCF has a mandate to support LDCs, Africa, and SIDS. And it so happened that majority of LDCs are in Africa. And so there is that strategic focus on strengthening LDCs, which coincidentally happens to be majority in Africa. The second motivation is also due to the fact that the accredited entities, those who access our funds and develop projects with the countries or for the countries, also have a strategic focus on Africa. And if you look at the impact of climate variability and change and what is happening in Africa, naturally there's a lot of interest in supporting Africa and making sure that the mandate that is given to us by the UNFCCC is met. But I will also say that the Latin America and the Caribbean, basically not only in terms of numbers, but they also have some strategic areas that they want to build and develop in terms of climate action. So they are developing bigger pipelines that we see the projects in our pipelines. And we think that in the future, there's a potential that Latin America will become competitive as we have in Africa.
Okay, thank you very much, Jez, for that. One of the other things that I thought came out of those three presentations was this sort of concept of there being value chains. I think you, Markus, talked about the meteorological value chain. We talked about hydromet value chains, and I think the presentation by Ina and Uni at the end both had that concept of data is a starting point, and you move through a chain to create solutions which then attract finance. Is that something, I'll start with Markus, is that something you found through the soft process you've actually had to start really exploring and thinking about in order that you can start to appeal to financiers?
Good question, John. And first, let me start saying thank you very much to you and your team for all your support in actually bringing soft to the level where we are today. So thank you very much. So I want to come back to the value chain. And what I personally realized, again, I mentioned in the beginning, I come from the development and climate finance community. I had little understanding about Earth observation, a basic understanding about satellites. I had no clue about something called radio sound, that for you in the Earth observation community is so common. So, and I think I'm not the only one. I was the manager of the World Bank Group Climate Policy team. So perhaps they had the wrong manager in this job. But my work assumption is that many decision makers in climate policy and climate investment have a relatively limited understanding about this value chain. And in our discussion, so we're trying to mobilize now $200 million. And I want to disclose one potential funding partner. This government tells us that it's all good, but actually we want to focus on the last mile, meaning the app for the fishermen in Lake Victoria, which is of course important that this fisherman has the relevant information, actionable information. But of course, this information can only be as good as the data that goes in. And as I tried to summarize in the presentation, today we have massive data gaps, huge data gaps. And actually these gaps, despite not too much, but despite investments and increasing investments are growing. In Africa, radiosonde availability of data, so radiosonde data availability, 2015 to 2020, declined by 50%. Now, if an African country wants to prepare a project for a GCF, of course, the GCF will ask, so what is the data? What is the data situation? What is the climate rationale? But if you don't have ground truth, Earth observation data, this goes back, Jana, to your image that you started us off with, then, as I mentioned, we are partially flying blind. So I think the challenge we have is to communicate absolutely. The only thing that matters is the end of the value chain, the right policy and investment decisions. But these decisions can only be as good as the input. And I hate to say, for quite a few donors, this is not very sexy. This is not very interesting. If you communicate to your as a government, if you communicate to your constituency, the population, It's easy to say we're actually helping the fishermen in Lake Victoria, instead of saying we are contributing to the generation of a global public good where everybody benefits, including, of course, the citizens of the donor countries, because we also know for each little weather forecast beyond 2 or 3 day 2 or 3 day time range, we need observational data from across the globe.
Thank you, Markus. I'm going to pick up a point there and ask, bring in Ina on this one, because Markus, you said, you know, you were at the World Bank, had a climate change policy, and you did not know about the Met world and the EO world. And Ina, I noted from right at the start of your conversation, your presentation, you said Earth observation needs to go out to the countries, not sit here waiting for them to come to you. And is that part of the same issue of those in the policy making area, those who are actually developing projects, those who are actually submitting projects of funding, and the funders don't understand, because they've not been made aware in many ways of the data and the value and what it can tell us? Is that something that you reflect on well in your work?
I mean, I don't want to generalize. So my lack of knowledge, for sure, there are much more enlightened decision makers in the climate policy and finance world than Markus was in his previous roles. But I was also 10 years manager of the World Bank in countries. So leading the policy dialogue and the programs of the World Bank with a few African and South European countries. I've never, ever got a demand from a Minister of Finance to actually invest in data generation.
No.
Again, this goes back to, we take it for granted. We have some conceptions about it, but again, I had no clue about the huge data gaps on the surface-based observations and the implications they have for better, more effective decision makers. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming years related to climate finance.
Okay. I'm going to bring you in here, and I'm just going to add perhaps a comment to what Markus has just said. I'm not going to mention any names. We once did a major project for a major corporate known across the world. It was a significant sum of money. The only thing they questioned on our proposal was that we wanted to spend £20,000 on bringing in new data. They asked us, why did we have to pay for data? And I thought that was quite an interesting conversation in the context of all the other money that was in this proposal. And I think that illustrates Markus's point about Ministry of Finance not investing in this. So, you know, from your perspective, is this an inflection moment where the Earth observation community has to go out and tell the world what it really has and what it can do, rather than wait for people to come?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. I think now is also a very good time. I think, you know, the whole COVID situation has also just opened people's mind that you can do a lot from remote. So remote sensing and how you can make products generated from that. But I would say that, yes, we as a community, we do have to change the way we work. It has been for the way too long, you know, a sit and wait approach. Nice scientific papers, we need research. By all means, we need research. But, you know, as I've said in another fora, we tend to, as a community, we tend to do a nice research paper, and then we move on to another research, right? But what is already happening on the ground and being able to make sure that this research becomes applied is in many cases not really happening. So that is why I think it's so crucial to now go out, make sure that the data are actually being used, and to do so, yes, we need to do the tough work of actually going out there and listening to people, understanding what they need. And in many cases, when we see the huge success, for example, simple technical backstopping, like I mentioned, you know, we did a very simple map for mangrove forest, updating the mangrove forest for Fiji, and they were so happy. And it took us, you know, 2 weeks to do so. And that was an information that they really lagged. So there are so many low-hanging fruits out there for this to become efficient and very useful, and especially when it comes to climate finance, I would say. So having these systems in place, but I really want to focus that it has to be a partnership, because we as a community, we really need to learn much more about how our data can be useful. So therefore, to do so, you need to have this dialogue. And if you don't have the dialogue, if you just say, I have a nice land cover map for you, many will say, okay, thank you very much, but what are we going to do with it? So unless you really talk to the specialists, because where you have, and what I think also Markus said, you have to make sure that the senior people, the senior decision makers, understand the value of this technology. And to do so, it is not technical courses that are needed. It is simply some awareness raising events that we do a lot of, but we have to have, again, the close dialogue. So I think that's extremely important for us as a community to open up and really talk to people and understand how we can make the data relevant for them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There. I'm just going to come back to you, Joseph, and perhaps bring in others as well. I mean, GCF receives project business cases for funding. When it receives those business cases, and my reflection is because for many years, well, several years, my company was asked actually by a country to review all applications, for example, to the adaptation fund. And one of the things we constantly found was the business case was lacking because it didn't have the real evidence database behind it. Is that something you see in the GCF, that if only the data and evidence base was stronger, the business case will be so much more stronger for the GCF to approve? Is that an issue for you, Joseph?
Yeah, thanks, John. As a climate fund, climate science, climate data underpins our investments. So what we look for is the robustness of the climate evidence. So evidence-based assessment and review is what we do. And we clearly have seen some weakness in the climate science basis and the data that some of the projects present. So the board, in one of its decisions, has requested that the Secretariat provides support to countries and accredited entities to provide robust climate rationale, which includes a climate science basis and the data that is used in designing the project. But not only that, but also looking at how both the project design and implementation could lead to better data being generated to inform future programming. And so for us, the data is very critical. Without the robust climate science and assessment that really shows that this is a climate problem, we would not be able to fund a project. And so yes, climate data, climate science, and robustness of those data sets are critical for our investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I turn to you, Unikrishnan, because I'm picking up this point about the business case and the robustness. I am going to, as soon as this is finished, I'm going to check out your discussion paper 27 because it sounds very interesting. But you talked about moving to investment decisions and bankable projects, and you talked about improving access data, using other data to combine it, for example, where Markus is coming from, all to support the business case for projects. So is this where you see Earth observation can make a real step change in terms of developing bankable projects and securing more finance? Is this an area that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, thanks for the very, very prominent question, actually. So yes, I'll say that when we move towards investment decisions and bankability within projects, maybe adaptation or mitigation projects, the most important aspect is that what is the kind of financing instrument or the financing mechanism that you're going to utilize in that particular project, actually. So are you going to go for grants, or are you going to go for blending of financial instruments? Because it's very easy to talk about public-private engagement in a particular project, but when it comes to the decisions around deploying that finance and also implementing that, it's very important that we have data and we have evidence. I can give you some examples. Like, for example, if you're investing on forestry-based mitigation projects, many of the financing entities do need data on the kind of usability of the land for the period in which the forestry proposal is being implemented. If it's a carbon market linked projects, you know from the CDM days that how significant it is to have the baselines being clearly mapped, and based on the baseline mapping, we go and see what additionality the project brings in. So this question of concreteness and additionality is clearly linked to the financing instrument and financing mechanism that you will be adopting in each project. And that's our experience as Climate Finance Access Hub, working in around 15 countries, where we have different categories of projects. Like, for example, we have projects in Mauritius, for example, on the coastal management, where there is still a possibility of adding renewables, but it's not getting the whole solar mapping is something which is not convincing for many of the investors. So we need unbiased data, which is basically Earth observation data in many of these proposals to get the buy-in from partners to make the project at scale. Otherwise, what we are seeing is that we are going for the kind of business as usual, 5 to 10 million proposals that are kind of one-off projects that are being implemented, and then what next beyond that is questionable. So it's basically to bring in more partners and to have proposals and projects at scale. We need clinching evidence, and also we need unbiased data so that the investors are more convinced in putting their money and making the scale bigger.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And I'm just going to go back to Aina on something, and just thinking about the technical platform and the data cubes you were developing in the project you talked about. Is this accessible not just to the public sector, but also to the private and investment and banking sector? Can they access this data as well?
So for Fiji and Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, these are open data cubes. So yes, so those data are priori accessible. However, we leave that to the government to decide. It is their data, their process. We want this to be government-led. So, but the data are open data. So yes, it should be available to everyone.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in Joseph now, but I'm also giving you notice, Jana. I'm going to pull you into this discussion as well, so you're not going to escape. So Joseph, there's a question on the one of the participants has posted about, on average, how long does it take to assess a project from start to end for the GCF? And do you think there's any way in which Earth observation or GEO generally can help improve and speed up that process?
Thanks for the question. I think it depends on the project. I mean, how mature the project is. Much of it also depends on the robustness of the climate rationale and the data, because that is what we first will look at in terms of addressing those specific problems. So a good data informing a good climate science basis goes a long way to facilitate or expedite the review process. And we've seen from our second level due diligence process that this is one of the determining factor in terms of the speed or how long it takes for a project to be approved. Those projects that are matured enough, it could take sometimes even as early as 3 months for the project to be approved. That is when it's submitted to us, and then we do the review process and submit to the board for approval. It could also take 2 years if the project is not matured, if the scientific basis is not there, and then the project cannot be approved. So the investment criteria is very, very critical. How you meet the requirements of the investment criteria determines how long the process will take. And also, in addition to that, we also have policies that needs to be adhered to. And then those are the 2 factors that determine how fast the project will be within our process.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Yeah, and I'm just perhaps almost the last question of the session. Just developing on from what Joseph's just been saying and what you've heard. You're the new director of GEO. So what's going to be on your to-do list of how GEO can work with the organizations that are represented by this first session this morning? You're on mute, Jana.
Always count on that one person to do that. I'm glad it was just me. So many strengths to pull on, but effectively, I think making sure that we're not shying away from having conversations with the communities that we are not insiders in. And really just turning the culture of needing to do these on a regular basis. You know, I was listening to this. So many of our member countries are funding all of these various regimes and funds, et cetera. It's almost like we have a duty and a responsibility to optimize these investments. So as I was listening, I was envisioning, wouldn't it be a grand idea to actually establish a standing brain trust of these entities, of these individuals, so on regularly conversing on the issues, coordinating to ensure that really our individual respective works has the most impact and really penetrates the farthest, the reaches, the broadest areas. We absolutely need to be able to break through the silos of the various ministries with which we talk. Markus said that, you know, on our side, on Earth observation side, oftentimes when somebody hears Earth observations, they think space and they punt us to the space agencies. And we want to be talking to the ministries of agriculture, ministries of water resource management, ministries of finance. It's going to take a minute, but I think collectively we can leverage our respective networks and break through these communication silos. So that communication is so high on my agenda, and we really need to hone our skills to do that. That means putting our work into context of policy briefs, using the networks that are out there, and then really on a practical level, and I think we'll transition to this, as often as I like to say, we really need to move from individual pilots. So no to pilots, but also yes to pilots, because the pilots, the work with the early adapter countries projects, they are giving us the opportunity to show examples of how these things can work and work well, and then allow the communities to build on them. You know, yes, Earth observation is not sexy, but I think it is being sexified. I mean, if you look at the, you know, on CNN, we have Planet talking about their fantastic imagery and their satellites. It's now in the mainstream news. So I think we have this momentum to work with. It just comes down to having the right collective of people, because down in the end, it comes down to people. And we're really fortunate that in this session, I think we have this group of people who is interested in continuing this conversation. So if we can't commit to actually walking the talk and truly partnering and truly informing our respective work streams through continued engagement, then we'll be on the way, because collectively our reach is pretty wide and pretty broad. So it's the people network, it's the communications, and it's practical, actionable sort of projects that can demonstrate what happens when you put Earth observation into the work streams.
Okay, thank you very much, Jana, for that. It just leaves me to thank Joseph, Markus, Einar, and Unikrishnan. You guys just make my job so easy. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed that session. Thank you, and over to Sarah.
Thank you, John, and all the speakers. I would like now to actually take a few minutes break so we can all have some water and prepare for the next session, which is about Earth observation in support of private climate finance, is likely a different angle to the same topic. And we will have 6 snapshot presentations that give an overview of the activities in the private sector here. So I would say let's meet again at 10:30 Europe time, so 30 past the hour for everyone. And we'll start again with Antoine Bavandi from the World Bank. Thank you, and see you shortly. Okay, I hope everyone had a chance to have a cup of coffee or drink of water for the next session, which is also very, very interesting and very packed. We have, as I said, 6 presentations with a focus particularly on the financial and insurance communities, what they are doing, utilizing Earth observation as a tool for informing and de-risking investments. So if everyone is ready, I see Antoine. Yes, everyone is here. Rika, are you ready? Possibly.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm now introducing Antoine Bavandi, Senior Risk Finance Specialist, Crisis and Disaster Risk Finance Team at the World Bank. He will introduce the topic of Earth observation in support of climate risk finance, including an innovative joint partnership between the World Bank and the European Space Agency, OBrien. Antoine, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present. This is a very exciting session and good to see familiar faces in the panel. My presentation is about showing really concrete examples of what we mean by making use of satellite data for concrete risk finance solutions to climate change. Next, please. A quick recap of where we stand at the World Bank on the climate change agenda. There's a new ambitious climate change action plan that was recently signed off, which is about really scaling up, ramping up our efforts around climate resilience, risk management, risk financing, in particular through the country climate and development reports, which are going to be new flagship reports for all of our World Bank client countries. Next, please. So in summary, there are 3 work strands around, let's say, climate finance at the World Bank. The first one is on disclosure, and that's about sort of ESG data for climate smart investments. And there's a role to play for the EO community. I'll get back to that later. Second, the main one, which was my core focus, is around risk management, understanding particularly the physical risks that, let's say, investments, banks, private partners are exposed to. And third would be the green finance pillar. And that's mostly about informing investments around, let's say, climate footprints, particular greenhouse gas emissions. Next, please. Disclosure and reporting. I think we have a very good lineup of panelists on this topic, so I'll keep this one really quickly. But the main message is that developing countries need simple, comprehensive indicators of let's say, climate throughout the entire sort of decision-making process. So we understand that there's the financial community, there's the EO community, there's policymakers, the private sectors. We want to make sure that clients benefit from these sort of different discussions, but through very simple, very accessible and transparent indicators. And I'll get back to that later. Next, please. So climate physical risk assessment. I'll give you a quick example just to, for you to understand how concrete, how applied this is at the World Bank. So what we are doing is trying to fill data gaps, and that's where EO data comes in very handy. This is ultimately a risk assessment for the Moroccan Central Bank, which asked us to kind of stress test their portfolio of credit risk. So you have to think about banks as being exposed through credit risk to potentially extreme droughts, extreme flood events, which could really put at risk their their clients and in turn affect their results. So they want to understand if, in this example, a major flood around Rabat Salé, in this case, can have negative consequences. So for that, you need first, which is kind of a key source of uncertainty, you need to understand the exposure. And because extreme climate events are very granular, you need to improve their current understanding of exposure by sort of mapping assets, buildings, block by block. Because a flood event will materialize only around, let's say, a river basin. And if you're next street up, you might not at all be impacted. So that's where high resolution optical satellite data is very, very useful. We cannot afford to do that at sort of national level. So what we ended up doing is really targeting key areas of concentration of exposure and doing these very specific EO-based, AI complemented, artificial intelligence also complemented exposure catalogs. And there are different steps then in the sequence, starting with the IPCC scenarios, understanding what will be the future, let's say 2030, 2050, new normal, and extracting from this new distribution what would be the extreme event, because that's what's of interest for this physical risk assessment. And we would then derive, let's say, a number of discrete events, let's say 1 in 200-year drought event, or 1 in 500-year flood event. And then we would need to propagate or characterize this event and its impacts through different sectors. So we need to put in place a dedicated macroeconomic modeling activity, which then will translate, let's say, the losses at agricultural sector level, or sort of urban industry and services level, the losses, let's say -5%, -20%, -50% of revenues for the clients of those banks. And ultimately, providing recommendations to the central bank. So it's a fully integrated, and I think I like the idea of seeing satellite data not as the silver bullet, but as a sort of one component, and often filling a gap of a much bigger process. Next, please. So to do that and to do things at scale, we set up a dedicated partnership with the European Space Agency and their Center for Earth Observation here in Rome, Italy, where I am based, to help us understand the potential of that technology. And I think that's a key message that I had, which is we cannot have the EO community work in silo. We need to make sure they understand our language, our clients' language. And so that's why we need partnerships. We need targeted partnerships, but in order to make good use of that technology, we really need to speak to each other and speak the same language. So we set up this very ambitious partnership a couple of years ago. And I'll give you a few examples of projects we are supporting. Next, please. Starting, I think, with drought risk finance in Senegal. So this is a project for the Food Security Council of Senegal. And we are looking at their existing, let's say, risk management framework. They're using ground stations, they're using ground surveys, they're using, let's say, vegetation indices, including from satellite data, but they do not have access to moisture data particularly from the Sentinel constellation, from the Copernicus constellation. So again, it's another example of very targeted contribution of satellite data to a much bigger process. In this case, adding the satellite-based soil moisture insight into their existing and fairly comprehensive already, this is Senegal, risk monitoring, drought risk monitoring framework, and enabling in turn new insurance application and bringing in the private sector, particularly because this is objective metrics. This is the beauty of satellite data. If and when we turn, let's say, indicators into neutral objective metrics, making risks become almost a commodity that any underwriter, any investment can understand out of London, out of Singapore. Next, please. I'll skip this one. I talked about mapping already. Next. And that's my conclusion slide. So effectively, in these three sort of key engagement areas that I described earlier, you can see that here there's a role that the EU community can play and should play, starting with the essential climate variables that I talked about, of making them very robust, very simple, very accessible indicators for our developing country clients. Second, on risk management, there's a whole range of activities. I described some of them. We very much like the idea of trying to turn satellite data into objective risk metrics, particularly for these applications, because that's going to bring in the private sector, insurance companies, or capital markets. And on green finance, I guess you've talked about it already earlier today. But my main message in conclusion is that these would work only if they are fully integrated into existing processes, and if the different disciplines do not work in silo. At least that's our experience, and we are very, very excited to have this strong partnership with ESA and the Climate Change Initiative, particularly on these aspects. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Antoine. We can all agree on what you said about the need to merge the two communities, finance and Earth observation providers. And it's great that one of our major partners, European Space Agency, is already collaborating with the finance industry, and this could inspire others in GEO to do the same. So the next speaker is David Carlin. We're continuing on the private finance domain. David is a climate risk lead at UNEP Finance Initiative, and he will tell us about the work UNEP FI is doing to help financial institutions achieve the tools to manage climate risk. So David, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to be here, and a lot of really interesting presentations. And I think many of these issues, you're seeing the interdisciplinary nature of these topics because of the fact that we need to have this all hands on deck effort across science, across the financial sector, across business, across policy. And so seeing where different tools can be developed, repurposed, and leveraged, I think is really important. If we go to the next page, I'll talk a little bit about the work that UNEP FI does, but I don't want to spend too long on that. Well, I don't want to spend too long in general, because I know we only have a little bit of time, but just to say that after the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, an instrument of the G20, issued a series of recommendations for how markets should understand climate risks, a number of our member institutions, banks, investors, and insurers really were looking for, okay, if we're going to be asked to assess this, how do we assess climate risks, both physical and transition? What are the tools that we need? And so over the past 4+ years, we've worked with a number of experts across the industry, a number of scenario developers, data providers, and of course, dozens of institutions to come up with approaches, as well as to explore and express best practices on assessment and management. If we go to the next page, I would say the focuses of our program have really been threefold. One about the scenarios used, and to that point about things being interdisciplinary, I think it's really fundamental that we talk about many of the scenarios that were developed were not initially developed for financial users in mind. And so as a result, some of the key drivers and assumptions of, say, integrated assessment model really were designed to answer policy questions rather than financial risk questions. Likewise, on the physical side, you have a lot of really interesting data that is very much about questions of not necessarily what will happen that will cause a loss event, but rather levels. So levels of warming, levels of sea level rise, changes in return periods for various physical phenomena. But the question is, how do we do a translation exercise? How do you take those types of scenarios and convert them into financial information? And part of the work that we've done has been thinking exactly about that, of what are the risk drivers? So how does risk get transmitted into the financial system due to climate-related events? Another piece, though, is recognizing that while that's a really helpful top-down way to think about the world, in making individual decisions for financial institutions about who to underwrite, what companies belong in their strategy, what assets are likely to be most resilient, then individual and really address level data on the physical side in some cases, or certainly asset level data for transition risk are really necessary. And what that means is working with different groups that are developing more local geospatial modeling, working with groups that are looking at the specific financial implications of different policies on a sector or on an industry, but really saying that we need to have the data in order to get this down to the ground level rather than just this top-down way. Then the bit on reporting and governance is to say, okay, if you've done these assessments, if you've thought about these, how do you actually get them out? How do you actually develop something in a report, but also in your internal governance that is going to make you more resilient to climate change? And also, how can you play a constructive role? And I think that's been a really interesting development for the financial sector, is seeing that it's not just enough to de-risk. It's far more important now to take an active role in committing to net zero, in committing to making a accelerated transition take place. And a lot of our thinking and work has been about how these different component parts can play a role in that. So if we go to the final page, a few of the papers that we've written over the past several months, and some of our forthcoming papers really aim to look at scenarios, aim to look at impacts of decarbonization, and at the range of tools that are out there and outputs that are necessary for helping to make decisions. And I think that this is important because for financial users, in a lot of ways, this is a very different world, but one that isn't going to wait for them. And so thinking about how all of the good work around analysis of phenomena, remote sensing, around more complex and sophisticated physical models, all of those pieces, how those can give institutional investors, give banks, give insurers the information that they need to start actually making decisions in a different way. And I think that that's the tie-in that UNEP-FI very much sees itself in, being a part of the UN Environment Program. We really see our mandate to not only help banks to manage and deal with their risks, but really to actively play a role in reducing the overall risk of climate change. And so that kind of idea of double materiality, I think, is one that we've really adopted and seen as important, in the sense of not only what risks do financial institutions face from climate and the tools that we've worked on to address that, but also what risks do they pose through their activities, and how can those risks also be diminished? And I think as we go forward, you'll see these conversations around risk and alignment take on a more intertwined relationship. And I think a lot of the tools that will be built and will be deployed are going to think both about how are you decarbonizing while building resilience. It's not that we can do one or the other, it's that both are necessary, and the financial sector has a critical role to play in doing so. Anyway, hopefully I've kept us to time, and very glad to hand back to Sarah now.
Perfect. You're even 1 minute early, which is amazing for my time management. And thanks especially for illustrating how Earth observation data need to get translated to financial scenarios for investors, banks, to really assess physical climate risk. And this shows an entry point for our community, really. So now I'm turning to two speakers, Jelmer van de Mortel, head of Acorn, Rabobank, and Mila Luleva, head of remote sensing for Acorn at Rabobank. And they're going to tell us about how a commercial bank is making use of Earth observation to support a financial initiative that helps farmers developing their forecast in developing countries. So, Jelmer, over to you.
Yes, Sarah, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for giving me and Mila the opportunity to speak at this event. We would like to introduce you in the next 10 minutes how we leverage remote sensing satellite data at the benefit for smallholder farmers in developing countries. We developed a proposition at Rabobank that we are currently bringing to the market. Shortly, perhaps a bit of a background. I worked for the World Food Programme, then as a strategy consultant, and I'm with the bank for 1.5 years. My colleague Mila has extensive background in geosciences and just joined the bank recently. Next slide, please. What we do is we help smallholder farmers, so those are always farmers with less than 10 hectares, in the transition to agroforestry. We believe that doing so, the agroforestry is an instrument that has multiple benefits. So one is that the smallholder farmers increase their productivity, hence become more self-reliant as a country as well on a regional level, improving the food security. It's also increasing on a regional level the land restoration as well as just the general topic of climate change as it's sequestering carbon as well. Next slide. So what are the benefits from agroforestry? Just to give you a bit of a background, from a smallholder farmer, it's improving the soil quality. It makes the farmer more resilient to climate events like heavy weather conditions. It diversifies the diets for a farmer. So instead of having a monoculture and also having a diet that is based on one main ingredient, different types of food come into play. And also he's less reliant on one buyer. So he's also diversifying his income streams. Next slide, please. So the proposition that we have developed actually is quite simple. In the early years, as an agroforestry scheme is being grown, there is not much food being produced yet. And what we do is at the time, then we already measure the delta in biomass on an annual basis. And this delta in biomass we translate to carbon removal units, as we call them. And those carbon removal units we sell on the voluntary carbon market to international partners. One, for instance, has been Microsoft that we once have sold to. And they pay a price of 20 euros per farmer per carbon removal unit. On average, a farmer can sequester 5 to 10 tons of CO2 per hectare. That means that a farmer with 1 hectare can earn about $200 per hectare. And given that those smallholder farmers have an annual income of $1,000 per annum, this can increase their income within roughly 20%. And what makes it unique is that 80 to 90% of all the revenues flow back to the smallholder farm. And that's a game changer in the market. Next slide, please. Because that was not able before. What we saw was that the cost of the transaction was simply too high. And that was mainly due to the very high monitoring cost to measure carbon being sequestered, a very high certification cost. And that's what we try to change with the satellite data, to lower the cost of the measuring and to make it introduce a new standard together with a partner to make also the certification scalable. Next slide, please. So in the end, what we are offering is a platform where we connect corporates that have the willingness to become net zero, have a pledge to do so, reduce the carbon footprint, but want to compensate the carbon footprint that cannot be reduced in the short term with smaller farmers that are able to sequester the carbon at the same time. This is technology driven to make it also scalable and cost efficient, and also enhances the traceability of where the carbon is actually being sequestered, increasing in such a way the transparency in the market as well. Next slide, please. This results in an ecosystem where we have on the one hand the farmers. Those farmers are always grouped with local partners that ensure that the farmers are trained, educated, that the logistics are in place, the organization of the seedlings and the saplings, and provide us with the field coordinates, the polygons. Those polygons we store on our platform, and we share with third-party remote sensing partners that do the biomass calculation with us, and translate into the carbon removal unit that's being bought by corporates. And I would like to give the word, if possible, to Mila.
Thank you, Jelmer, and good morning to everybody. Pleasure to be here. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we have one framework that we follow and a methodology which is currently being approved by external validators. Our framework contains the eligibility criteria for farmers to join our program. And the methodology follows is the procedure from our side, how we calculate the carbon removal units. Next slide, please. So I don't think I need to explain to this group the importance of Earth observation data in these global projects, but the way I would like to go over the way we use satellite data on multiple parts within our development and our product. So the first, of course, the first aim is to ensure that our measurements are cost effective and they don't result in expense for the farmers or for us on our side. We use also satellite data to ensure that our ground truth data, which we use as input, is high quality. And of course, we then use satellite data, of course, to monitor the fields of our clients. So we do acquire data from Sentinel satellite mainly, and we use also LiDAR, terrestrial and aerial technology to collect the ground truth data. As Jelmer already mentioned, we work together with satellite parties within currently 2 companies in the Netherlands, and together with them and the remote sensing team at Rabobank, we develop artificial intelligence models, which are then used for biomass calculation. The accuracy and validation of those models is performed very strictly following a strict protocol, and it is completely independent for all data developers. Next slide, please. Just to look into a little bit into ground truth data, as you can imagine, this is the most important and crucial part because the accuracy of the output depends really on the accuracy of the input. So we take special care to define the sample plots to select them and to measure the trees and collect the information within the fields. Next slide, please. This data is then fed into artificial intelligence models, which then produce biomass estimates for change in the last year of tree growth. And these are then converted into carbon removal units that we compensate our farmers with. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. I would like to take the last minute to mention where we are at the moment, where as we speak, we are now printing the first results that our first clients are receiving. We are generating the first carbon removal units for clients in Ivory Coast, Uganda and Tanzania. Very exciting time. But what I would like to mention here is what is our goal, where our goal is firstly to make impact, and that impact is only possible when we scale. So of course, us being very ambitious, we are aiming at 15 million farmers to make use of minimum of 15 million farmers to make use of our technology. And we believe that with clients like Microsoft and the full support of Rabobank behind us, this is a very achievable goal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yelmer and Mila, for presenting this concrete example on how satellite imagery is coupled with ground truth data to provide really accurate measurements on biomass to support this financial scheme for farmers. Now, I'd like to move on to the next speaker, Christoph Christian, who leads on the Satellite Application Catapult Sustainable Finance Program. And they are promoting the geospatial technology innovation for the financial services market, and is going to present us an example of asset level for private climate finance. And Christoph, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. And thanks, Sarah and the GEO team for inviting me to speak today among this really quite impressive panel of people and colleagues I'm thrilled to be part of. So I'm Christoph, I'm the Sustainable Finance Lead at Satellite Applications Catapult, but I'm also associated with the Oxford Sustainable Finance Program at the University of Oxford and the Center for Greening Finance and Investment. And this center is recently set up, and it's really around helping private financial institutions integrate climate and environmental data sets and considerations into their investment decision making. And particularly a big emphasis on physical kind of climate risk and models. So we've been working with various types of financial institutions on various types of use cases and trying to push this agenda forward. So I will start my presentation today with outlining what we believe is really the kind of, let's say, the value proposition for Earth observation data in sustainable finance or private climate finance. I'll give a couple of examples of applications, commercial applications that are being used, and then I'll highlight a project that we've been working on, which is all around open asset level data for high impact industries. And next slide, please. So setting the scene a bit, basically what we're seeing is that the private financial sector is increasingly looking at climate and sustainability issues, and they're trying to understand how these are impacting, on the one hand, the future financial value of their investments, but also how their investments are positively or negatively contributing to these issues. We're seeing a lot of investors and financial institutions coming together in alliances or coalitions that are committing to align their investment portfolios, for instance, to Paris Agreement or to net zero targets or even nature positive outcomes. But a common challenge across these agendas is around the data that is needed to implement these strategies, and data that is fit for purpose for financial decision making. Sustainability data, or environmental, social, and governance data, ESG data, as it's often kind of referred to as an umbrella term. The ESG data that financial institutions use, they typically have quite a few, let's say, issues still that come back when you talk to financial institutions. And basically is because one of the reasons is that the bulk of this data tends to come from disclosed information from corporates that they invest in, which is all self-reported. This reporting or this sustainability reporting is not mandatory, so it means that not all the companies are reporting, so you've got data gaps. As there's no standards, it means that reported data is actually often not comparable between different companies that do report. And as reporting typically happens only once per year, the information is often outdated by the time it reaches the investors. And then all this information, if it is available, is typically ingested by these financial institutions through ESG ratings from rating providers, who, based on their own methodologies, will aggregate all this information into a single ESG score. And because these, they use different bespoke black box methodologies, you will often see that for the same company, different rating providers will come up with a completely different ESG score, as the graph tries to show it well, showing that there's quite a lack of correlation, if you like, in terms of assessment, of sustainability assessment of companies across the rating agencies. So it does mean that financial institutions actually have very little confidence in any of the ESG data, or most of the ESG data and ratings that are out there at the moment. So next slide. Now, against this kind of rising interest in sustainability considerations by the financial sector, we've obviously got the technology advances in our sector, in the space sector, which means that we are obviously capturing a lot more Earth observation data than ever before, at higher quality and more different types of signals, than we've ever done. I think the image of GeoGSat is a great example of really high quality, high accuracy kind of greenhouse gas emission observations that weren't possible a couple of years before. And we're also seeing, on the other hand, the advances in data science mean that we can actually make a lot more sense out of these huge volumes of data that are coming down. But inherently, at the core of Earth observation data, we think there's a kind of, there is an inherent value that is useful for financial institutions, and that is extremely complementary to the current ESG data sources or the voluntary disclosures that investors rely on. I think we've heard some of these arguments before, but Earth observation is inherently neutral. It's an objective source of information. It's inherently comparable. Data from the same instrument, you can collect data across different locations across time and compare how things are changing. It's a lot more timely, as you've got data collected in a much more frequent manner. And inherently, it allows for bottom-up analysis from what you're seeing on the ground, let's say at a physical asset level, which allows you to aggregate all this information upwards to the kind of company investor level. Next slide. And it's really kind of that level of asset level information, which is important for financial institutions, particularly when they are considering issues such as climate change or biodiversity loss and other environmental and social issues, because many of these issues are inherently location specific and thus require a spatial lens to understand them properly. So this is what we call spatial finance, but it basically means integrating geospatial data and analysis into financial decision making, which maybe for our sector sounds straightforward, but for the financial industry, for many processes, many standard kind of financial investment decisions, the geospatial aspect has really not been that important at all to date. But the main advantage of, let's say, a spatial finance approach or a geospatial approach to these risks is that it allows you to understand risks, opportunities, and impacts in a bottom-up way. So in asset level information that is collected from the physical asset level onwards can be aggregated at the company level, at the portfolio level, or any geographical level really that the investor is interested in or is exposed to. So it offers information and insight which is a lot more granular and actionable than what you're getting from other information sources like corporate disclosures. Obviously, also using these type of data sets allows for a lot more transparency between investors and investees, and even provides, information or data and insights to both governments as well as financial environmental regulators and civil society, who can start to scrutinize the behavior or the risks that the various companies or investors and their portfolios are exposed to. We break down kind of asset level information kind of two types of asset level data. The first type kind of being asset data, which is information that is inherent to the physical asset, such as its location, the ownership of the asset, the age, and other inherent features. And then you've got observational data, which is a lot more dynamic and time specific, which can be emissions, it can be around productivity. And this data is typically collected from sensors, video on satellites or drones on the ground. And both types of data are not necessarily always the same or collected in the same way, but if you combine those, you get some really powerful insights, particularly with regards to climate and environmental issues. If you go to the next slide, please. So we're increasingly seeing commercial solutions that are leveraging these technologies and these type of data sets to offer financial institutions a more granular view of climate and environmental risk, particularly in the kind of physical climate risk space. We're seeing either financial institutions starting to use these data sets directly. I think the example of Antoine earlier was a really nice example. But we're also seeing companies that are developing or building platforms or tools or new types of more granular risk scores for financial institutions based on asset level data and kind of downscaled hazard information or climate models to really get to information or insights that is at a resolution that is relevant for the financial decision making. And they then tend to, rather than present this information back in maps, it'll come out in spreadsheets or APIs or scores or a whole range of different dissemination or communication means, if you like, that fit a lot more with financial institutions processes rather than kind of the traditional map type information that we work with. So next slide, please. Another type of application that we're increasingly seeing is around emissions modeling and transition risk or climate transition risk. So this example, for instance, shows analysis done by Transition Zero, which is actually a not-for-profit analytics company that uses satellite Earth observation data to understand the productivity of specific assets, to see which ones are more or operating more often or not, and then mapping this against the kind of capex and opex costs. They can see which ones are more likely to make a loss or a profit, which they can then compare against other assets to see which one are more likely to go out of to be taken out of rotation and be stranded than others. And I'm seeing I'm massively running out of time, so let me just skip to the next slide, please, and the slide after that, and just quickly highlight one project that we've been working on ourselves. So it's something that is crucial for spatial finance and these applications to really come together and add value is that asset data. So information that tells you where physical assets are located and who owns that information. And particularly for high impact industries such as heavy industry, oil and gas, or others, it's important to know asset level information to properly understand physical as well as transition climate risk for financial institutions. But this data is typically missing or it's incomplete, and there's a lot of issues with accessibility. So a piece of work that we've been doing is trying to create open asset level information for the cement and steel sectors by using, on the one hand, Earth observation data and machine learning models to identify where in the world are the cement and steel plants, and particularly there's big gaps in China and other emerging economies where the data is just not as readily available or transparent. We've deployed this model to identify where these assets are and basically created a whole database, a global database of these assets. And then we also went through a whole range of company disclosures and country databases to link these assets with their ownership, information about capacity, production type, etc., to come up with a kind of global database of these assets that can be used by financial institutions, data providers, as well as governments and civil society to do climate and environmental risk themselves. So the next slide, you'll see what the data set looks like, which again, the output is a spreadsheet rather than a map, which is how these users tend to, or many of these use cases tend to actually use and ingest this data. But I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Christoph. You were not massively delayed. We're still on time. And I think everyone in the audience is very much sold about the value of Earth observation, but you provided a novel angle for our GEO community, illustrating the importance of Earth observation information at the asset level for companies to measure their exposure to climate impacts, as well as greenhouse gas emissions, to assess both the physical and transition risk. So now I would turn to a team of 3 presenters, and I will also ask them to be very concise so we can have a good discussion afterwards. We have Matthias Range, team leader of the Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance Unit at GIZ. Job Udo, senior consultant on flood risk management at HKV consultancy firm. Dominique Aulener, senior catastrophe and business development analyst at Allianz Re, the global reinsurance arm of Allianz. And they will tell us about another brilliant public-private partnership between government, the insurance sector, and the Earth observation providers applied in Ghana for climate risk transfer. So over to you.
Yeah, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Hello, welcome. My name is Matthias Range. I work, you can go to the next slide, please. My name is, as you heard, Matthias Range. I work for GIZ on the topic of disaster risk finance, and me and my colleagues, Dominic and Job, are glad for the opportunity to share a blink of our project on urban resilience in Ghana. And it's indeed nice to see the close colleagues in the audience. Hi to everybody. As you know and heard throughout the whole conference so far, risk management is a very complex and interministerial process. We are glad that the focus on response has been changed over the last decades, and that the attention is now including various strategies of risk reduction and preparedness, and even a certain understanding of building back better when the damage has happened to avoid doing the same mistake again. You all have also been witness over the last 15 to 20 years or so that the retention and risk transfer solutions has become an integrative part of disaster risk management approaches. So it has developed to a multi-layer risk approach, which we call an integrative disaster risk management approach. Unfortunately, almost every intention or attention, and thereby most of the funds, are focusing on macro schemes and forgetting the potential of including all stakeholders and offering individual, sustainable, unsubsidized solutions and leveraging a root resilience in the societies. So we looked in our project into the understanding what a city, a municipality can do by themselves in order to contribute to the resilience efforts of a government or of their government. What is in their own interest? What is in the interest of the stakeholders located in these cities, the SMEs, the households, the critical infrastructure? What are their capacities? To which toolbox do they have access, and is there a way to broaden that toolbox? Next slide, please. To be able to do this, and risk assessments, as we heard, especially from Antoine, I like that presentation a lot also, is crucial. And risk assessment is quantitative, but also qualitative data crunching. Only based on this understanding of which hazard do we face now and in future, and what exposure do we have, physical exposure, now and in future, or actually it's not only physical, it's also the social, the cultural, everything is will determine our vulnerability. And this baseline is crucial. Only then we are able to determine a cost-benefit ratio for all possible activities from which, in this case, a city can then determine their own individual mix of disaster risk managed activities. And one of that was insurance, and we also looked into that one. Next slide. Insurance has several advantages, but the original idea is to transfer these risks that either cannot further be reduced or that the measures need to reduce the risk make economically no sense. And this brings me to three statements. Insurance can only be part of a full-fledged approach to make sure that risks which are not being insured are being handled, and that the risks are reduced in such a way that the leftover risk, which is insurable then, well, is becoming insurable, which means that it is affordable to the clients. My last statement is that, as you see in that picture, data is crucial, or let's put it the other way. Data is not everything, but it is crucial. Over to you, Jo.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias, and thanks, Sarah, for having us. So let's directly go to the next slide then, because the part that we did is actually quite necessary if you want to develop an insurance product. You need to quantify the risks as much as possible, and especially the level that we used, which is at let's say object level. So we developed the flood risk model for Accra, and therefore GEO data, remote sensing, satellite-based data is essential, but also the validation of that data and let's say elaboration of that data on the ground, based on ground truthing and ground survey. So when we develop the flood risk model, we start with developing a flood model which produces hazard maps, as you can see on the left, and it uses partially satellite-based rainfall curves, which you can see on the right. So once we have the hazard maps, next slide, please, we also need to know more on exposure data. So again, we use satellite-based data, but we also made field surveys to get a better understanding of what we see from satellites, how that is actually on the ground. And once we have the spatial layer of the exposure data, we go to the vulnerability and damage information. As I mentioned, we did this on object level. So we used, let's say, standardized vulnerability and damage curves for buildings with respect to flood. But then we, through different workshops, we elaborated those vulnerability curves very specifically to the owners of these structures on the ground. But the most important thing in this whole setting up of the risk model was actually quite a terrible disaster in 2015 in Accra, when a huge flood hit the country and a lot of people died, and a lot of damage was also caused by that event. And quite shortly after that event, there was an impact assessment mission, in this case from the World Bank, to quite thoroughly try to assess the actual economic damage of that event. And that enabled us to actually calibrate this vulnerability, and especially the damage model that we did. And the fact that it was calibrated and that it well, presented quite well the situation in Accra gave a lot of trust of the local people, and I think also helped with the accuracy of this flood risk model, which enabled within this project to develop the insurance product needed. And that's something that my colleague Dominic will now elaborate a little bit on. Dominic?
Yeah, thank you, Joop. Thank you, Matthias. It's my pleasure to add the insurance sector perspective. I hope you can see and hear me. That's great. So we are the last ones actually in the value chain, and we are, next slide, please. Next slide, please. And we are depending, of course, on appropriate risk reduction measures and also appropriate data and risk models. So we are leveraging that data and that models to design tailored and adequate risk transfer solutions. And in our case, in the example for Accra flood, we are providing indemnity-based flood event cover for the individual municipalities, and to make sure that the cover we are offering is tailor-made and also affordable. We are really using the estimated losses. So we run the model that Joop and his team are providing. We run that model. We estimate the losses for specific return periods, for specific probabilities, and based on the risk appetite of the customer, which is in that case the municipalities, we provide then an adequate policy cover. So that's the end of our presentation. Thanks a lot. We're all happy to take your questions.
Perfect. Thank you all. And that's another great example of collaboration that can inspire our community, and especially those who are working at the intersection of climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So I'm turning to the next speaker for the last presentation of this session before the panel discussion, Matt Foote, Senior Director, Research and Analytics at the Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers Watson. And Matt will tell us about the recent global initiative on open physical risk data and analytics. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks, GEO, for the opportunity to contribute to this, a very important workshop. Next, please. As you said, this is about a new global initiative called the Global Resilience Index, or the GRI, which is a public-private sector collaboration that's been formed to develop and make available trusted baseline sources of open access physical climate risk modelling and reference data. As Antoine's already said, there's a real need to scale up efforts on resilience and adaptation at a global scale. And both Jana's and David's presentations that we just heard have highlighted the need for collaboration, particularly between the finance sector, policy sectors, science and societal stakeholders to tackle these challenges together. because obviously adaptation to physical climate is not something that can be done individually at the scale that we know we need to achieve. But to do that needs effective approaches to the measurement of climate risk so that those stakeholders can work together to a combined plan and to understand how to support effective resilience strategies and investments over time. And as we've already heard from a number of speakers, to deliver the information needed to both report and disclose that risk and the changes in that risk by organisations and the progress they make through reports like TCFD. And of course, while we know some of these are not mandatory at the moment, they are becoming increasingly mandatory across the world and by different regulators. Next, please. So while the metrics related to assessing organisations' decarbonisation strategies and the progress they make towards things like net zero and Paris alignment, they're pretty well defined. Physical risk, actually, we believe, isn't as well represented. And this particularly limits the ability for organisations, regulators, and the wider stakeholder communities to continue to assess the potential benefits that can be made from increased resilience investment to changing physical risk across all of the sectors, including humanitarian, infrastructure, green financing, investment, and the development communities. The project that we've put together is an ambitious exercise, and it's intended to create globally referenced sources of data across hazard, exposure, and vulnerability components of the risk equation, as we've heard before. And its success will only be in its ability to provide the indices and metrics used by all of the stakeholders to mainstream this ongoing risk measurement within climate adaptation and to provide the evidence base needed to quantify the benefits of any increased investment in resiliency at those national and subnational scales. Next, please. The GRI was formed last year, so it's relatively new, particularly in response to commitments made to the COP26 financial sector team led by Mark Carney at an Insurance Development Forum meeting in December of 2020. It brings together a number of leading experts across key influencing organisations, and they're across the public and private community, and that includes the Insurance Development Forum, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and particularly a new UK government-funded research consortium, the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, which Christoph has said already includes his Spatial Finance Initiative team. Next, please. The project builds upon established approaches to model and quantify physical climate risk, and particularly inspired by the global risk model produced for the UNDP global assessment reports both in 2015 and 2017. That model and the associated data that came with it on an open basis provided the first really globally consistent approach to quantifying risk against present day physical hazards, and is used by development organisations across the world. But additionally, the Global Earthquake Modelling Foundation, GEM, with its long-term development of data, methods, and tools for the quantification of seismic hazards, has already provided a proven method for the delivery of open and interoperable trusted global data. Next, please. The GRI, as it's been formed, will extend and enhance this core modelling resource for climate risk, but for future-looking climate-related conditioning. And a task force has been formed between the partners. This has developed the roadmap and a plan for the delivery of the GRI to a clear vision, again, which all of the partners have agreed to provide globally consistent and transparent metrics that represent that potential scale of future change based on commonly applied financial metrics. We've seen some already for the value at risk, particularly long-term average and extreme tail. Next, please. So the GRI is going to create a core platform of data and risk models tailored to the specific risk and resilience needs of each of those stakeholders, and supporting and evidencing the adaptation strategies that are made against future climate risk, physical climate risk, and that's on an asset, a systemic, and national or global scale. Importantly, we're going to act to create a consistent framework for the integration of more granular and specialist analytical tools. So this is one layer, a global level, which allows entry of other models on the same consistent basis for future climate for instance, including the Insurance Development Forum's Global Risk Modelling Alliance, the GRMA, who are developing a whole range of very detailed extreme risk models in support of the V20's need for global public and private partnership against risk analytics. And those will be fully aligned with the GRI's higher level framework. Next, please. So the GRI is going to be developed and delivered in 2 phases. One, and the first is to the run-up to COP26 this year, which will be a pilot global model of selected physical perils and risks, including current and future global flood risk. And this is one example of a visualization from the data and the modeling that's already been created. And then a second phase, which will be the organizational and technical platform and the extension of that to the full range of physical perils, and to include all of the vulnerability and resilience indexes which will be needed to support each stakeholder. Next, please. And one of the reasons why I'm so keen to be talking here is because obviously I hope you've realized already that Earth observation data is critical to this project in every aspect, both as the core data in the construction of each modelling component, the hazard, the exposure, as I've already said, the assets at risk from Antoine and Christophe, and also the vulnerability, and combined to then deliver the response of assets, whether they're physical structural assets or natural resources or anything in terms of population risk and demographics, to those shocks or chronic changes in climate that could then influence the way that resilience strategies are developed and actioned. As a source also, though, as alongside that input data and other data to enable local characteristics of risk to be captured as well as possible within the global framework, which is obviously critically important. And will also then include the validity and the validation of this model to those key stakeholders, which is a key, obviously, source of data from the Earth observation community, both historical, post-dictive and predictive on an ongoing basis. And then to capture those key trends through the baseline changes of urbanization, land use, and other factors as this model is developed over time. But importantly for me, I think as well, and we've already pointed out, a picture paints 1,000 words, it's the visualization and communication of these risk factors and the indices to the end stakeholders through geographical visualizations, which will be extremely important. Next, please. So as I said, there's a roadmap for this. The GRI will be launched officially at COP26, with that pilot model being presented in the Resilience Pavilion and hopefully in the Blue Zone as well. And also then to the operational launch of this over the next year and a half into the COP27 launch of the full system. And obviously, given the critical role that spatially structured data, as I said, is going to have with this project in delivering every component, GEO and its partners and the wider community for Earth observation can obviously play a critical and key contribution to its successful delivery to every stakeholder. And the consortium of the GRI welcomes contributions from everybody on this call and the wider community to realise this potential of this ambitious project. And so thank you again for the opportunity to present it. Obviously, please do contact our colleagues at the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment with the email here, who are leading the pilot development and would welcome contributions and advice and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. It's a really good way to conclude our session with an initiative that sort of covers all the pieces of the puzzle. And it's now time for the panel discussion. So I'm turning again to John Firth for an interesting discussion with all the speakers. Can you please turn your camera on? I'd like to remind everyone that for clarification questions on the presentations, we have the Q&A box, so please continue posting the questions. There are already some interesting answers that can be further elaborated on. And in addition to the questions from the audience, we have 2 main guiding questions. So first, I would like to hear more about how Earth observation can become the next lever in private climate finance, and especially how the GEO community of Earth observation providers, as well as governments, academia, and the wider constituency that we have, can contribute to these ongoing initiatives or even new initiatives alongside the sustainable finance industry that we have here today. So over to you, John, and the speakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you again to the presenters for some excellent points raised. And I hope the participants picked up that, and this wasn't planned, but what you heard were a lot of the similar phrases and words from the earlier sessions focusing on public sector. And we heard again about merging communities, engagement, collaboration, talking the same language, all hands on deck, multiple data sets, coupling data. So it is interesting that different perspectives from the private sector and from the public sector are all realizing some of the key points, key issues that have to be addressed if we are going to progress Earth observations use. But just to start off with, and picking up that first guiding question about how can EO become the next leader in private climate finance, one of the questions we had, which I think is very relevant to that, the question was, how aware are the ESG data providers of Earth observation data and its potential to contribute to their analysis, which is then obviously used by the investment world? So I'm going to ask, first of all, David, perhaps if he could answer this, because I know there's been so much work, UNDP working with the investment sector, and perhaps Christoph to contribute to that as well. David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, John, and of course, great to see you and great to be here. Yeah, just quickly to say, I think that providers are increasingly aware of the data, and you, I think, see sort of on the edge of the space people that are doing some really interesting and creative things. Some of that, you know, the work of ESA and taking that and using that as input data. Right now, I think there is still a bit of a challenge on the integration front of how do you actually take some of this really interesting and leading data and translate it and convert it. I think you're looking largely at folks that have been in the industry on the physical side that started with catastrophe modeling and are sort of changing or modifying their approaches for climate. And then this assimilation of new data, you know, comes on top of a huge stack of existing old data already around, you know, very granular things like flood maps and others. And so to my mind, it's an important window. What we're both waiting for and, you know, hoping to see happen, I think, is somebody to really make that strong tie-in to financial impact, even if it's on a very granular level, so for a particular asset. And I think maybe those are the best initial use cases rather than for portfolios for particular investable assets as a starting point.
Okay, Christoph, have you got any thoughts on this?
Thanks, John. I think, no, fully echoing what David said, I think there's the ESG data providers are increasingly becoming aware of it. They're not fully using it yet. I think they are being applied to some kind of some niche-ish use cases or some initial kind of R&D developments on their end. But it's quickly rising on the agenda. I think particularly the first step that they're now all talking about, we're starting to talk about, is asset level data, and asset level data being just a pure asset level information. And it doesn't necessarily mean therefore they're looking at observation data, just knowing how many assets or what type of assets a company owns, how many coal-fired power stations instead of gas-fired power stations, or instead of renewable energy assets, is already quite relevant for their kind of carbon intensity metrics that they have on companies. So they're starting to definitely embrace kind of the asset level data type approach as the next level of their analysis, and they're all at kind of different paces. What is actually also interesting is that quite a few of the ESG or particularly kind of the financial data and rating providers have been acquiring ESG data and increasingly climate and environmental risk analytics companies over the last couple of years. Actually, Willis, Watson, and Acclimatize is an example, but also quite a few others. I think Carbon Delta being acquired by, was it MSCI? I don't know, and then 427 by Moody's, or the other way around. But so there's definitely the big players are starting to more and more look at this space and take this more seriously. I think maybe a couple of things to emphasize on remaining challenges. I think there's still a kind of, for all of these data providers, the value is also in they want ratings of this as broad coverage as possible, as many companies as possible. So they need information on as many data industries as they can, and particularly kind of the asset level data that links physical assets to companies and specific industries is key to bring Earth observation to bear as a useful piece of information, and that's lacking for many industries, or it's not accessible. So the scale of data information needed is still a challenge. And there's also inherently some industries where Earth observation data is a lot more valuable than others. Any land use based industries or any kind of resource intensive industries is a lot more, Earth observation data can have a lot more value than, for instance, in IT or any of these kind of the Microsofts and the Googles, which are, they have a big market cap. So they are actually big parts of financial portfolios. So there is a bit of, not mismatch, but it's as David said, finding those initial kind of use cases where you can demonstrate the data at scale is what needs to happen now.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Matt Fort, I'm intrigued about the GRI, and actually just picking up on this point about the early stage introduction of Earth observation to ESG. But also there's this wider point of, and I think Christoph also picked up on this, about the standardization of ESG. So is there a role for GRI to play in that space as well?
Thanks, John. I think there's a role for GRI and the wider community to play in that. And to pick up on something Christoph just very importantly said, I think, is that I also think from an ESG perspective, for sure, there are a lot of suppliers and available data, including things we do. But I think one of the challenges is the ability for those data sets and the models, including what GRI is trying to produce around consistency and openness and transparency, is that if data doesn't have clear provenance and hasn't got an open basis for which people can see fully what the data sources are, how they've been constructed, the assumptions made to characterize and capture attribution from that data, as Christoph just said, it's very difficult then to be able to compare different sources of information, and there is no one source, and the GRI won't be a single source for everything. As I said, a framework is critical because you need to be able to integrate different granularities of data for different approaches, enable comparison between certain sources. Now, climate change and climate conditioning of future climate states, as you know better than anyone, John, then means that you need to understand the metadata that describes the assumptions and the baseline inputs of scenarios and other factors that then drive the outputs from those individual models, so that you can then compare, contrast and integrate different sources. And that's no different from any part of the risk equation, whether it's the hazard, the exposure, or the vulnerability. And on the exposure, and I'd agree totally with Christoph, as far as I'm concerned, the exposure is a major weak point in a lot of physical climate and wider ESG data, because there is no consistent global approach to its capture. Now, the SFI is starting to lead the way on that. And I think it's an amazingly valuable project because it actually allows for the first time people to take a core database which has been constructed specifically for this purpose, understand it and apply it in derived forms, but with a consistent base. And I believe that's absolutely critical, because one of the things we have seen papers in recently, I think maybe some people have seen them as well, is for different climate-related physical risk databases that are used to assess different organizations at the corporate level, there's a large difference in the outputs that come out, and there's a big discrepancy between relative risk for corporates based on how they've been constructed. And one of the things that's been highlighted is the lack of consistency around the asset level exposure data that is being captured. So the SFI and other institutions and initiatives like the GRI hopefully will encourage the open and transparent capture of consistent data that can then be used across the board more confidently. The last thing I'd say on that actually is it's not just about the physical characteristics, it's the linkage of value estimates as well, which are absolutely critical. And those value estimates are going to vary significantly by the stakeholders. There's a lot of work to be done there. And again, I believe Earth observation can help to characterize valuation estimators, inferential, that can be very useful across large scale areas. There's a lot of areas, I think, where that can be applied.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I was going to ask Antoine a question, but I think he's had to leave. But and then I was going to draw in Matthias. So I'll start with you, Matthias, and expand the question. I noticed when Antoine was talking, and he was talking about the work in Morocco, and he talked about working with the Moroccan Central Bank on credit risk. And I guess for most, and you talked about net averted damage. Now, for most people in the Earth observation world, the credit risk is something that affects whether or not you can get your next credit card and what interest rate you get, and not understanding that the world of banking, and the same with insurance in terms of data sets, metrics like a net averted damage, that's how the world is viewed. And one of the challenges is translating climate modeling, Earth observation data into the language and models used in the financial sector. So perhaps to you, Matthias, and obviously Dominic, and you'll come in as well, is that translation of Earth observation data and talking to the climate change world, has that been a challenge for you to get them to understand you see the world differently through the lens of insurance risk management, and the same with banks? Is that part of the problem we've got here?
Let me start let me start and at the same time hand that question over to the industry. I think Dominic is the best to answer that. But however, I would still like to answer another facet of that question. Is not about for us especially. It is also a very critical discussion of how to translate that data and make that data available for our partners in the countries, for our partners who are sitting in the ministries, who are involved in city planning, in risk management planning, and so on. So all the data which we are gathering right now, and I agree with everything which have been said in terms of harmonizing the approaches and also the indicators. We have to make that available for our partners that they can use it. We often see situations that this data is first of all very static, so it is extremely difficult for example, in the city of Accra, to update that data by themselves, and by that to make it dynamic, to also to play around in terms of future planning. And also, what we often missing as well is a certain interface for them to actually interpret it and to read that data, since they may not be an IT expert, or the IT expert is not available. But at the moment, for everything what you want to do with this data, you need an IT expert to be able to read it in the first place. So I think we have to make that really to unleash the power of this data which we are trying to gather and validate on the ground. As Job said, very crucial. We have to make it applicable also, not only for the industry, but also for the people who are actually making the political decision on the ground.
And thanks, Matthias, and I'm happy to add my perspective. So what I for sure can acknowledge is that one of the biggest challenges is the translation of the forward-looking of the climate change risk into financial impact metrics, which are in particular used by the investment management colleagues, also here at Allianz. So this is exactly what you said. So we are still talking different languages, and the colleagues in reinsurance where I'm from are already familiar with all the risk terminologies. But for the colleagues from the investment areas, and they are now really on the forefront. When Allianz invests into new offices, we of course have a long-term horizon, a long-term investment horizon, and we need to know what is the impact of climate change on for such investments. And this last mile, actually, the translation into the financial impact of new investments, for example, that's a challenge. Yeah, and I can confirm that we are collaborating on this with different colleagues within Allianz, from investment, from real estate investment in particular, and reinsurance and risk management.
Okay, thank you. I know we're conscious of time. I'm gonna ask a couple of questions to Jana now to finish up with, if Jana's online.
Yep. All right.
Hi, Jana. The first one was a question that was asked partly in relation to the earlier session, but it applies here. And I was going to talk to the Rabobank presenters, but unfortunately they're not available now. But there was a question. I mean, we know that one of the challenges with the climate change models is they are very top down. Earth observation gives the opportunity to be bottom up as well, and that's a critical issue. We've heard that from the finance sector and the public sector. But in terms of indigenous groups, you know, how can we go that last mile so that Earth observation is accessible to indigenous groups, such that, for example, it could help in the Rabobank situation where we're actually helping those local farmers from indigenous groups? What is it that GEO can do in this space?
So I think the biggest asset that GEO brings in this context is the fact that we are the forum that effectively convenes the various sectors. If we count the number of governments that we have, over 120, and we count the number of organizations and companies from tech industry, from major space operators, public and private, that participate in our forum, we really do provide the space for that one conversation take place that brings all of these actors together. So these various actors that are on the line now do not have to develop individual separate communication channels with all of this multitude of players. So I think just to put kind of a larger picture out there, I think that is sort of GEO's potential and fostering these conversations and making them more recurrent. And that's number one. I know I'm not quite answering your question just yet. I'll get to it just after my second point, because I was reflecting on what I was hearing. I think we're also perhaps at another potential inflection point where, unlike in the sort of traditional sense where government was always seen as sort of the anchor customer for Earth observation, including satellite observations and the innovation and research in that space, I think we are getting closer to the point where the private sector, the industry, is also potentially going to become that anchor customer, which will help to soften, to buffer against the risk, the innovation in that technology sector that can then help create those kinds of data analytics products that our speakers were talking about, integrating those various data, which is difficult to do. I think a lot of times that innovation in that space maybe is not happening at the right pace because, you know, companies in private industry is still a bit risk averse. But if there were to be that assurances that there is that anchor customer that will use those analytics and those products, there will be far more inclined to develop them. So investment from the industry into that upstream could really, I think, change the nature of this paradigm and even out sort of the government-backed, also by industry-backed innovation and research. And as far as our engagement with the indigenous communities, again, we're starting it just now, one of our new frontiers. And it is going to take, again, a group of actors working together. We're already putting data to use through hackathons that have been quite successful, where modern sort of satellite observations and other modern data is being utilized in combination with traditional knowledge, and just doing more of that, but also then working with other organizations to bring internet connectivity, broadband connectivity to those remote locations where the indigenous communities live, so that our interaction with them, knowledge exchange, technology exchange can in fact be facilitated. So it all hinges on collaboration and cooperation without any doubt, but we are seeing this perhaps unprecedented momentum of all of these sort of everyone breathing that same air, and the opportunity is there. So I think I sort of, in the end, touched on your question.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I know we are pushing for time, and I just want to say thank you again to the presenters. I've learned so much this morning. I hope the participants have as well. From my point of view, I've always been completely convinced out of the Value Earth observation data, but we've got to get out there and tell people about it. That's my message to everybody. So thank you very much, Sarah, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, John. I have only a few things to say before also passing it to Jana for final words. And I would like to thank you and all the speakers, the moderators of the previous days, for the exciting discussions over the last 3 days, really. And thank to the GEO Secretariat staff and the GEO Climate Change Working Group members who supported the planning of this workshop and participated in many ways to make this a success. And let me remind you that all the presentations and recordings will be shared with everyone, and we'll also prepare a nice workshop report that we intend to use to inform our deliberations in the next years. And with that, I'm passing the mic to Jana for the closing.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And I can only add my thanks to everyone who joined us, not just today, but I see many of you were with us also the previous 2 days. And it really was one continuous sort of flow for us from the GEO perspective, fostering and nurturing and strengthening the communication between the science community, the policy community, and the finance community, because one is very much dependent on the other. So we're really looking forward to continuing this. Like I said in my opening remarks, in the end, behind the institutions and companies are the people, and we're really delighted to build on this energy and see how far we can take it. We will be dissecting all of these outcomes for sure, and we do think that perhaps what makes the most sense is to actually look into specific sectors to then again bring back sets of players around specific sectors to be in the position to more accurately articulate the need for Earth observation, the need for technology support, the need for innovation, the need for the right level of partnerships. So it gives us a lot of really exciting material to work with. And I hope you hold us to this promise that this was just laying the cornerstone. The pillar has to go up. And we really are counting on your goodwill and in continuing this relationship moving forward. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jana. And the workshop is over now. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. We don't have any like fireworky stuff. Rick, come on. We want to do this closing better because this is just too abrupt.
Yes, I agree.
Sorry, no fireworks. I didn't foresee it.
Okay. Bye-bye. Next time we promise fireworks. Do take care, everyone.
Bye, and thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.